Fresh water. As we know, fresh water comes from precipitation, and when it hits Earth's surface, some immediately soaks into the soil, becoming groundwater, some will get evaporated, and the remaining water is runoff, or water that flows over the ground surface. But what determines whether water soaks into the ground or flows as runoff? Well, there's three factors. First, the nature of the ground surface. Can water soak into the ground surface? Is the surface soil or is it pavement? Right? Second factor is the rate of rainfall. If there's a heavy downpour, then it's impossible for all the rain to get soaked into the ground, and some of that is going to become runoff. And the third factor is whether the land is flat or hilly. Gravity pulls water downhill, and if the hill is steep, like towards the top of a mountain, water will move so quickly it runs off instead of soaking in. If this continues in the same area along a trench or a channel, it forms a stream, and this is the beginning process of forming a river. Now, if you were to go on a hike in the woods, you may cross a stream or a small river. Well, that stream or river is actually just called a tributary, or a smaller stream and river that feeds into a main river. A river and all its tributaries together make up a river system. And due to the pull of gravity, they will all move downhill in a continuous path, just like water going down the drain in a bathtub. The land area that supplies water to the river system is called a watershed. If you were to look up a watershed, or the land that supplies water to the Mississippi River, you would see it is absolutely enormous and covers more than 3 million square kilometers. Now, while streams and rivers have water that are continuously moving, the water in lakes and ponds are still, or called standing water. Ponds and lakes form as water collects in low-lying areas of land and are filled with rainfall, melting snow and ice, and runoff. There's no definite rule that defines a pond from a lake, but basically, in a pond, sunlight can usually reach to all the bottom parts of it, whereas lakes have parts that are too deep for sunlight to reach all the way to the bottom. Another system of water are the wetlands. A wetland is an area of land that is covered with a shallow layer of water during summer or all of the year. They usually form where water is trapped in low areas or where groundwater seeps into the surface of the land. Common types of wetlands are marshes, swamps, and bogs. Now, wetlands that occur along the coast or coastal wetlands contain both fresh and salt water. They include mangrove forests and salt marshes, which are some of the most protected areas on the continent. Now, it took a while for people to understand wetlands because at first farmers and builders considered them to be a waste of land because it was useless in order for them to develop crops or to build buildings. However, after learning more about this unique habitat, not only do wetlands provide a mean of living for the wildlife that live there, but wetlands also provide a natural water filtration system, and they also help control floods by absorbing extra runoff from rains. They kind of act like a giant sponge that stores water and gradually releases it. If these wetlands get paved over, then they can't do their job and the land around them quickly floods. Now remember that about 2/3 of fresh water on Earth exists in the form of ice found in the North and South Poles. And about 85% of that ice is part of the ice sheet that covers Antarctica in the form of a glacier. A glacier is a huge mass of ice and snow that moves slowly over land. Glaciers form where more snow falls each year than it actually melts. And then over time, layers of snow pile on more layers of snow, and the weight of these layers press particles of snow so tightly together that they form solid ice. Now there are two types of glaciers: continental glaciers and valley glaciers. Continental glaciers are ice sheets that spread over a large area, like on Antarctica or Greenland. But the most common glaciers are valley glaciers, which form in the mountains and kind of look like rivers of ice sliding down the valley. Sometimes large chunks of glaciers break off or calve and float away and create icebergs. Icebergs are made of fresh water, and when they break off into the salty ocean, they float. Now, if you were to see an iceberg, you would actually be seeing only 10% of that iceberg, and that's because 90% of the iceberg actually lies below the surface. And this is the part of the icebergs that are so hazardous to passing ships in the ocean. Every source of water that we've just previously talked about occurs at the surface. Now we're going to dive into underground water, or water that trickles downward between particles of soil and through cracks and spaces in layers of rock. Now, different types of rocks have different size spaces for water to move through. Some material of rock allow water to pass easily or is said to be permeable, like sand and gravel, while other materials like clay and granite are impermeable, meaning they do not allow water to pass easily. When water reaches an impermeable layer, it is trapped and it cannot soak any deeper. So the water over time will begin to fill up spaces above the impermeable rock until that area in the soil is completely saturated with water, and this is called the saturated zone. The top of the saturated zone is called the water table. And if one knows the depth of the water table in the area, then this can tell somebody how deep you must dig in order to reach that groundwater. Now, when an area of groundwater is found below an unsaturated zone, which is a layer of rocks and soil above the water table, then this is called an aquifer. Aquifers can range from a small patch of permeable material to the area the size of several states. Many people obtain their drinking water from aquifers and also use this water for their crops and for their livestock. Now, how people get this water from the aquifer to drink is they can drill a well below the water table. You may see old movies depicting people lowering buckets down into a well to bring up water. And this is how they actually used to do it. But today, wells are dug with well drilling equipment and pumps are added to bring up that groundwater. Now, sometimes if water is trapped in an aquifer and that water is under great pressure, then that pressure will actually send the water spurting up through a hole, and the water will be able to rise without adding a pump. And this is actually called an artesian well. And many times groundwater doesn't come spurting out, but it comes to the surface quietly and bubbles and flows out of cracks and rocks, and this is called springs. Some springs contain water at normal temperatures, but others, like those in Yellowstone National Park, contain hot springs, or water that is warmed by hot rocks deep below the surface. But sometimes groundwater comes to the surface less quietly and it actually shoots straight up into the air into what is known as a geyser. And a geyser is a type of hot spring from which the water bursts periodically into the air due to the pressure that builds up in the narrow openings in the rocks until the gases and the steam and the hot water erupt high into the air. All right, let's take a break. It's time to show what you know.